This is the part where I can just easily make the quote, "I have seen things that you will never believe," and that thing is Harrison Ford not playing Han Solo at a very young age. That's fucking weird. Okay, so, kind of on a whim, I was kind of bored, and I figured, you know what, I'm gonna watch a movie tonight, and I figured since Denis Villeneuve's sequel, Blade Runner 2049, is coming out, I figured I would kind of dive back and watch the old Blade Runner. To kind of clue you guys in, there are a bunch of different releases of this movie, and I actually last night was just watching TV and I caught the theatrical cut, which, by the way, I would like to say, the theatrical cut has terrible editing. I'm kind of astounded, like, everyone talks about, it's kind of hard to determine what is the definitive movie-going experience, and I can understand why people say that, because the theatrical cut, its editing was very much jarring as fuck. It felt like a hatchet job, almost. Along with the narration that they use for Harrison Ford, to almost give it like a neo-noir type of feeling, which I actually like that a lot. I do like the idea of Harrison Ford kind of narrating us through the movie and whatnot. And sure, I could say, like, it was so-so, like, it wasn't that great of a narration, but, like, for the time, I could see it working. I could totally see this working for, like, a neo-noir movie to kind of bring you into the future while still holding your hand along the way. But yeah, so I watched the final cut of Blade Runner. So there's a couple of different versions in this DVD set. I watched the final cut, which is like the quote-unquote definitive version to watch, and it's the most comprehensible version of the movie. So Blade Runner is about Harrison Ford, who plays Rick Deckard. He is an ex-Blade Runner, which is essentially a cop who hunts down replicants, which are these android humanoid beings that are actually deemed illegal after a massacre off-world. Essentially, his mission throughout this movie is to investigate and hunt down the 4 replicants who illegally made it to Earth and retire them. Not kill them, retire them. I will say though, like, when it comes to this movie, what I've heard a lot about is Blade Runner is one of the more influential movies to come out of the 80s. A lot of people say it's influential for its camera work, its moody aesthetic, a lot of smoke and lights. Mainly the music, I thought, was one of the things that stuck out in this movie. Vangelis is the guy who did it, and Vangelis did a fucking great job. I don't know if you guys know, I am sort of a sucker for 80s synth, for like, I wouldn't say like vaporwave, but like Carpenter Brute, Kavinsky, like those sorts of artists, like that kind of style that I assume comes from Vangelis, essentially. Like, Vangelis was the originator of that sort of thing. Or not the originator. Vangelis was more or less the predecessor, if you will, to, like, those guys. And I assume Kavinsky and, like, Carpenter Brute and Magic Sword, like, all of those guys were inspired by people like Vangelis. But, yeah, more or less, I could dig that soundtrack. I kind of want to buy the soundtrack on its own, just because of how, like, eerie and soothing it actually is. It's really good. Like, I'm genuinely shocked at how much I liked it. Also the fact that, like, everything they managed to do effects-wise, whether it be using miniatures to display, like, flying cars, overhead shots of the city, I felt like they did a fantastic job. Like, Ridley Scott fucking knocked it out of the park, and it shows. Ridley Scott pushed the envelope when it came to movies like Alien, Blade Runner, Legend was another good one. That was like one of the ones that was more or less like fantasy based, but it definitely did leave an impact when it came to like practical effects and stuff like that. I can see why people really do say that Blade Runner is one of the most influential sci-fi movies of all time. It's a very gritty neo-noir, cyberpunk sort of movie that like gave birth to a whole genre of sci-fi films. Okay, so let me just get back on track here. I want to talk about the characters of Blade Runner. And unfortunately, the one thing I didn't like about it is it reminded me a lot of Drive in the sense that nobody really talked as much. It's more or less like one of those things, I wish there was more dialogue for this movie, and I really wish, like, I can see the acting chops of Harrison Ford, like, aside from the fact of, like, just seeing him, like, analyze things and investigate. Like, sure, he's that stoic anti-hero type of character, the kind of character that's, like, very much stone-faced. I would have really loved to see him do some more, like, acting in it, other than just kind of standing there looking at things. I felt like that was a majority of the movie, like, Harrison Ford looks at things, the movie. On the opposite side of Harrison Ford's character, I do want to say Roy Batty was fucking great. Roy Batty, played by Rutger Hauer, was awesome. Essentially, he is a replicant who is fully developed at this point to have emotions and to have more or less all the humanistic qualities that a replicant would actually have developed. And I gotta say, fuck, that's terrifying, because he is so intimidating. He doesn't even need to say anything, and he just is scary as shit. The scene that sticks out to me, and spoilers here, he's trying to find a way to get rid of the 4-year cap that all androids have, which is a failsafe. Supposedly how it's told is essentially replicants have a 4-year lifespan as a failsafe in case they escape. He's basically trying to demand more life from his creator, Dr. Tyrell, and he tells him he can't do that, and he needs to kind of embrace the short life that he's had. And Roy Batty ain't having none of that shit, because he, like, kisses him in a sense of, like, thank you, and just gouges his fucking eyes out, and, like, you see everything. There are a few things in movies that I have a hard time watching, and that was one of them. And especially the fact, since, like, the whole time you're watching Rutger Hauer as, like, when is he going to become unhinged? When is he gonna have that moment where he just fucking snaps and he goes apeshit? And that's literally the moment where it starts, and then he kills the guy who brought him there, and then he starts howling like a wolf at fucking Harrison Ford, and then it just goes off the fucking rails, and you think he's gonna kill everybody, but it's the moment where he's, like, gonna shut down, and I think he realizes, I'm going to die, I might as well go all out, and it's just, oh my god, it's nuts. Some of the complaints I do have about the movie, obviously, are I do wish that a lot of the characters, a lot of the main players, had more lines to say. They were very much, like, silent the entire time, or had, like, 1 or 2 scenes. So, like, I guess more or less Pris or Zora or even Leon, they kind of showed up at times, but they didn't really have key lines that, like, defined their characters. They were just kind of robots who were here, and they didn't really, like, make a statement of any sort that really, like, showed them, like, that they didn't really have any, like, spotlight moments, and I do wish that's the case for Blade Runner 2049, that most of the characters that are either replicants or just actual humans that are main characters, or, like, even side characters, get their, like, moment in the sun, you know what I mean? I do think, though, like, if anything, I liked how Edward James almost would leave, like, a clue to every scene, like, to mark where he's been. So, like, with the origami stuff, or, like, the Matchstick Man, which is essentially a good, like, spot for the end of the movie. I like that sort of calling card thing that Gaff was doing throughout the movie, and I feel like, I hope we see something similar to that in the new movie, because that would be pretty interesting to see Denis Villeneuve pull off some insane, like, plot twisty shit with that. I think going into it, more or less, this movie, I was very much surprised. I thought it was going to be a very complex plot, and I thought it was going to be more or less a movie that was, like, you had to read deep into, and, like, sure, a lot of people say that it is a very complex movie about, like, androids and human life, and just life in general, but more or less, like, I felt as if it was pretty easy to comprehend. Like, I was told while on Twitter that the final cut is probably the more comprehensible version. Maybe that's why, but I'll have to, like, watch the theatrical cut, or, like, the international theatrical cut, or the director's cut, or the 75 other versions of Blade Runner that actually exist within this goddamn Blu-ray. But the point is, I enjoyed Blade Runner very much. I'm very excited for Blade Runner 2049, and I really can't wait to see how Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford parallel, because looking at Harrison Ford in this movie, I could totally see Ryan Gosling in this movie, because he definitely looks the part, he definitely looks like a Blade Runner agent. Seeing him in movies like Drive or Gangster Squad or any of those sorts of movies, like, you can tell he can definitely play the part. And I genuinely want to see him side by side with Harrison Ford, who is going to be coming back as Deckard. because obviously he got away. In this movie, he ran away with Rachel because of the fact that she is also a replicant, and he's in love with her, and they only have a short time left. But point is, getting back to it, I do want to see what happens with Deckard, knowing that he's back, and, you know, I want to know what happened to him after all this time. Obviously, we'll find out when the movie comes. Alright, so, with that said, I do want to say I very much enjoyed Blade Runner, and I would definitely encourage you guys to pick it up before you go see Blade Runner 2049. I will admit I thought it was more or less a little lackluster, but I genuinely did enjoy it, and I had a fun time watching it. So I'm curious what Denis Villeneuve's going to do with the new one, and yeah, hopefully it's going to live up to the hype. Oh hey, I'm back to talk about Blade Runner 2049, and I have seen some things that you people would not believe. So, I talked about Blade Runner last night, and I obviously did enjoy it, and I very much enjoyed a lot of what Ridley Scott did in that movie. As for Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049, I fucking loved it. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I think it's probably one of my favorite sci-fi movies of this year. Hell, I would say it's probably one of my most recent favorite sci-fi movies of all time. That was, oh my god, that was such a good fucking movie. Now, I will say it did very much live up to the idea of that it kept the same tones that Blade Runner brought forth, and it very much did something with it and made it its own. Like, I never thought it would actually do it. Because when you hear about, like, a movie like Blade Runner or, like, Mad Max getting a sequel so many years later, it kind of comes into question, like, how the hell are they going to do that? I mean, with Mad Max, that's a different story because it's by the same director as the previous ones. As for Blade Runner, it's a whole new ballgame. Ridley Scott wasn't directing it, he was producing it. But when it comes to, like, Denis Villeneuve, with the fact he's had, like, successful movies such as Arrival, Prisoners, Sicario, I would think he knows what he's doing, but I am genuinely shocked at how well he pulled this off. I would say the biggest change when it comes to Blade Runner 2049 versus the actual Blade Runner movie, I would say more or less the visuals. It still kept the same aesthetic of like neon and holographs and all this stuff. It just, the one major thing that changed was how clean it actually was. Like, Blade Runner 2049 was probably one of the best shot movies I've seen in quite some time. It was so fucking pretty. On the flip side, Blade Runner, the actual Blade Runner, is very gritty and very dark. It plays with lighting, and it uses a lot of, like, smoke and lights. It plays to that field, almost. Now, don't get me wrong, Blade Runner 2049 did the same thing, but a little bit less. It didn't really, like, go over the top. It set moods more than anything. So I guess, if anything, if I want to equate this sequel to any other movie, it would probably be, like, Mad Max. Because Mad Max was a sequel that came out several years later, and more or less it was about Max himself, but it introduced new characters into the fold, you know what I mean? So, like, while Rick Deckard isn't the main character, he still plays a very vital role in this movie. Basically, after the end of Blade Runner 1 and a couple of other incidents, Jared Leto's character, Nander Wallace, finds a way to integrate bioengineered life into society. Replicants become more acclimated. Now, the only thing, of course, is older models that are more or less in the Nexus line from the original, they're still being retired and hunted down. And, of course, we focus in on Kay, Ryan Gosling's character, which, by the way, big spoilers here. I'm just going to put that out there. Big spoilers in this video vlog, because I'm talking about both movies and you need to know stuff. I was genuinely shocked when I found out at the beginning that Ryan Gosling was a Blade Runner, but he was also a replicant. I'm basically operating under the modus operandi that, oh, replicants are still hated in this community. Like, they're still called skin jobs and stuff like that. So it's weird to see a replicant working for the law, you know what I mean? It's kind of cool to see that society has sort of, like, progressed a little bit to be like, alright, they're cops. Some of them can be cops. That's understandable and that's fine. But you could still see the fucking racism there, and that's fucking weird. And the only reason I'm saying that is, if you don't know, in the original Blade Runner, at one point in one of the cuts, there was a narration essentially saying that skin job was the essential equivalent of the N-word. in that society. We pick up on Ryan Gosling's character as he's hunting down a replicant played by Dave Bautista, and amidst this, he finds an anomaly in the dirt, and it turns out to be the bones of a replicant, which they do an autopsy on. We basically find out that this replicant that died of complications due to an emergency cesarean sect, which, if you know what that is, that's something that happens during childbirth if there's complications with the pregnancy, which in this instance shocks everybody because a robot making babies makes no fucking sense. So from basically this point, the lieutenant is like, we need to shut this shit down. They find out that there's a possibility of procreation in the replicant circles. It's going to be violence, it's going to be a riot, or it's going to be an uprising. We can't have that. We need to have balance and order. So you shut this shit down and you find the kid and kill it. From that moment on, I'm like, holy shit, the cops are fucking intense in this. From that point on, the movie goes oh so many places. It goes into more about Nandor Wallace and his practices in bioengineering, making new replicants and whatnot. It goes into self-discovery with more or less where Kay came from, where his background is. It goes all over the place. And the one thing I loved about Blade Runner 2049 was the fact that Denis Villeneuve expanded upon the world of Blade Runner. More or less, like, with the first movie, you saw California, and you understood that it was a cyberpunk world. It was dark and gritty. It was very much haggard. But in the sense, you only were in that town. You didn't understand more than that. In regards to 2049, you see a lot more. You see California, you see the... I wouldn't say the off-worlds, you would see, like, the outer limits of California, more or less like another district of it. You'd see San Diego, how it's like a wasteland, and there's more to it. You saw the Wallace Foundation, you saw a bunch of different things, and a lot of that was awesome to see a world being built further and further. The best way I can explain it is like when you watch Mad Max, because Mad Max, you're in the wasteland, and you're in Beyond Thunderdome and all this stuff, and then Mad Max Fury Road came out, which focused way more on the wasteland. Like, you saw the Bullet Farm for a little bit, you saw a bunch of different areas of the wasteland, you saw those people in that world, and that was fascinating to me, and I'm very happy that Denis Villeneuve did something like that with this movie. It basically gave me a better understanding of how Kay and Deckard and Joy and all of them lived, you know what I mean? Like, it gave me a better understanding of their worldviews and whatnot. Now, I gotta be honest with you, I am absolutely happy with the fact that there was way more action in this movie. Now with Blade Runner, as I mentioned before, there was a couple of, like, gunplay scenes, but that was about it. With Blade Runner 2049, it was like they knew when to pepper in certain moments when it came to, like, action scenes and whatnot. Like, right off the bat when he's up against Dave Bautista, and he's trying to take him in, but he's resisting and whatnot. When it comes to, what's her name? Love, whenever... there was a couple of fights with Love. Whenever Deckard and Kay got into a bit of a scuffle, like, that was fucking cool to see them at their moments have the action scenes that we wanted. Because I feel like Blade Runner, I had a hard time really kind of latching onto it. It was more or less silence when it came to most of the scenes. Like, the action really happens near the final reel of Blade Runner. Yeah, I don't know, it's just more or less, I'm kind of happy to see that there was action within this movie. Like, there was gunplay, there was fighting, there were moments that made the movie tense, and that was fucking awesome. So one other thing I really loved about 2049 was the connections it actually made to the original. Now, of course, it has to make connections when it comes to being a sequel. I more or less just enjoyed the fact that they were so subtle, or there was reason to make the connections. One of my favorites personally is the scene in which he's trying to find Deckard, and he has to interrogate a former colleague of his, Edward James Olmos, who at this point is very old and he's in a retirement home, and he's asking him more about his work relationship with him. I love the fact he's sitting there still doing origami, and he's just kind of like making the little creatures that you remember from the first movie, and you're like, oh shit, his calling card's back. I don't know why, it's just kind of cool to me to see those connections. Whether it be through, like, certain files, because they have to have, like, a database for a lot of the stuff, so, like, they had voice recordings, or even the Void-Conf test results, or the test recordings. They had that stuff, and they played it back for you, so if you were watching this after watching Blade Runner, you're like, oh my god, this is fucking cool they've kept it in. They've preserved the previous film. A lot of mentions of Rachel are obviously in this movie. I was gonna say, of course, Tyrell gets an obvious mention when it comes to his involvement with bioengineering and all that stuff. Because, of course, in the previous film he died, so there had to be some mention of what happened after the Tyrell Corporation went under. Because, of course, we come into the world in which Nander Wallace is responsible for a lot of the bioengineering and replicants being integrated into society. So, as for the acting, I will say I did enjoy Ryan Gosling in this movie. He very much fits the part of a replicant, very much robotic. He's very robotic in this movie, and I think that was more or less, like, if he was acting the same as he was in Drive, I can forgive that because it fits this role if he's a replicant himself. I did appreciate a lot of the stuff he did throughout the movie because he's kind of calling back on old memories, which you don't know if they are implanted memories or memories he's actually having, so he's kind of, like, having that inner struggle to kind of figure out who he is. Is he a person? Is he a replicant? Was he programmed? Was he born? Like, I don't want to get too much further into it because I don't want to, like, ruin that for you, but it really does make a fucking difference in his acting. I do gotta say, Harrison Ford, though, it feels exactly as if he just got off the set of The Last Jedi or something like that, because he's essentially playing Harrison Ford in this movie. Now, I don't know if that comes with old age, but, like, watching him after watching him as Deckard in Blade Runner, I can totally see he's still trying to keep the same personality, but seeing he's like this grizzled old ex-cop or whatever, you could totally fucking tell. I don't know if he's like just kind of like fucking whatever about it, but he really did. He did okay, I would say. He did pretty well. There are obviously two other highlights to the acting, and I have to say it would be in the form of Sylvia Hoeks and Jared Leto. Sylvia Hoeks in this movie, she was fucking great. Like, she's supposed to be this replicant who's almost like the equivalent of Rachel in the first film. However, instead of, like, falling in love with Deckard, she goes batshit insane trying to find Kay and trying to find Deckard and basically trying to wipe them out. Plus, the combat that she does, she's fucking awesome in that, but she showed that she's a fucking threat and is terrifying, and I would never want her at my front door because Jesus Christ, she would kill me in a heartbeat. She almost, rather than being Rachel as a replicant, she did the equivalent of Rutger Hauer as Roy Batty. Like, she fucking went off the goddamn rails. As for Jared Leto as Nander Wallace, it was cool seeing him. He was very much like a cold and calculating sort of villain. The only reason I can't really, like, say villain without the air quotes is because he had, like, 2 scenes. I don't know what it is, like, with him. He has, like, 2 scenes in all of his recent movies. Suicide Squad, this. He essentially does, like, 2 or 3 scenes and is out of the movie entirely. I would really love to see more of him. I don't know if it's, like, he gets shit cut from the movie, but I would have really loved to see him act more. Also, I will say, if he acted like he did in Suicide Squad, I think he would have made a much better Joker, but that's just besides the point. Him in this movie, as Nander Wallace, was pretty fucking creepy. He kind of is like, got this god complex thing going on where basically he has built and engineered all of these replicants, and he considers them as children. I did like him for what he did. I just wish there was more of him in this movie. Okay, so, as for the music, because Blade Runner's soundtrack was fucking amazing, and that was one that revolutionized kind of soundtracks in general. And how did Blade Runner 2049's music do? Pretty fucking well. It kept the same tones as the original Blade Runner. Who did the soundtrack? It was Hans Zimmer and Benjamin Wallfish. They did a great job. They kept to the tones of the original while adding their own flavors and whatnot. Hans Zimmer, of course, is a master when it comes to soundtracks and scoring music for movies and stuff like that. He's very good at what he does. I just love the fact that they kept a lot of the synth elements in. I do really wish Vangelis was a part of it, but what can you do? I enjoyed the hell out of that soundtrack and definitely will listen to it when I can. If I were you guys, though, I would first watch Blade Runner: The Final Cut. I think it's the most comprehensible version of the film. I prefer, though, looking back, I do wish the narration was still in the Final Cut, but it isn't. I think it explains a little more, but getting that movie itself, that was a really good way to introduce myself into Blade Runner. And then watching Blade Runner 2049, I think they both worked back to back. I think it was a very good way to pick up on the movie, basically to kind of go into the future and find out what happened after the Tyrell Corporation went down, and how society in 2049 California has progressed, and a lot about Kay and his relationships and his past and his everything, basically his career and all this stuff as a Blade Runner. It was fucking awesome. I really enjoyed that movie. Watch it if you can. I would highly recommend it. It's probably one of my favorite movies of the year. Thank you guys for watching this video. It's a little bit different, a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new, and yeah, hopefully you guys liked it. Anyway, I'll talk to y'all later. This is John, signing off. Have a good night. Hey guys, what's going on? John here. Just wanted to take this time to thank the following patrons for helping this video be possible. Special thanks goes to Mr. Fred Gaming Nudori1, The Hex Universe JPV, Elrux Carlinius, The Lazy Leo Doc Ryder, Winkmaster Zojin32, That Girl Chaz, Jarrett Smith, Dustin DeRochambeau, Martha the Cactus, Hero Star the Henshin Gamer, Blaze Chris, Chilled Chaos, and Suicide the Pink Fluffy Bear. And again, I want to thank you guys so much for supporting and pledging throughout the time that you have. If you want to, please do me a favor and click the link below. It's patreon.com/JohnPage. You can also buy some sweet merch over there. We have shirts, we have snapbacks, all the old to Smarty shirts are still there, and there's going to be some new merch coming up soon. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.